So I think the main problem is that Toys R Us didn't expect a liquidation of Toys R Us. I think Toys R Us actually expected that there would be a successful reorganization and continued to probably order inventory in such a way that it would be a going concern. Obviously, the cash flow profile did not support that end game, so it did wind up being a liquidation. And so the duration of sort of the downtrend has been a little bit longer than I think originally anticipated. And Hasbro called out on the call that largely the big problem with Toys R Us is what it's going to look like in France and Spain under new ownership, and then what's happening with Asia as well and that Toys R Us business, because that's been a pretty good business for them in the past, and there's no real end game tied up for them with that right now.
What happens in the U.S. then in terms of filling that void?
Well, I think in the U.S. they have to find other vendors that can take that. And Courtney talked a little bit about this in her segment and saying that, you know, the logistics costs change a little bit. People want less inventory. They want it closer to point of sale versus Toys R Us, where they would sort of front load that inventory ahead of the season, and they'd be able to take those shipments and hold them longer from Hasbro or from Mattel. So I think it's going to take a little bit longer to work through that and find the right channels to reach the consumers properly. But I don't think that that inventory sale opportunity is lost permanently.
Is there any trade policy risk to any of the toy makers?
I think some of the risk is really in just what is made overseas and how it gets here. But remember, Hasbro and Mattel both make, you know, roughly or sell roughly half or more of their toys internationally. So you don't have the same sort of exposure as if you're making everything overseas and bringing it to the U.S. As you do if you are making it overseas and sending it overseas. So I think there's a little bit of a hedge there for them.
Jamie, there has been trouble for Hasbro and some of the toy makers in Europe for some time beyond the Toys R Us issue. Can you explain sort of your theory about how that gets fixed, if it does, and when? I mean, what's going on over there in Europe with those changing consumers' trends that these toy makers are fighting through?
I mean, I think historically it's been just a much more fragmented industry. There are a lot more local players that they're competing against. And understanding the distribution network in a market that is not local or not your domestic market always tends to be a little bit more difficult. And so I think that plays into it as well. And then obviously the overarching theme across many of the toy makers, and if you look at some of the data across the industry, is that there is an increase portion of the wallet going to video games and other sort of digital channels away from traditional toys. But Hasbro has been able to pivot in the past. You know, their games business languished earlier in the decade. They were able to pivot and turn that around. And I don't think that they are sort of resting on their laurels at this point. They are trying to pivot the business to cater to evolving demands. And I think that's something that they are nimble enough to do.